There are moments in life when silence becomes more powerful than applause. For Meghan, that moment came not in the grand halls of Windsor, but in the quiet hum of a California morning. The sun rose gently over the hills, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and salt, and for the first time in years, she felt no eyes upon her. No cameras, no whispers, no expectations, only stillness. She woke early, wrapped herself in a soft linen robe, and stood barefoot in the garden, watching the light spill through olive branches. This, she thought, is what freedom feels like, not loud, not triumphant, but tender. She had spent so much of her life performing, smiling when told, standing where directed, speaking lines written for her by others. Now, there was no script, only breath. In that stillness, she realized something profound. She had not lost a crown, she had reclaimed a soul. She no longer needed validation or an audience. She needed quiet, purpose, and the slow rhythm of her own heartbeat. Her rebirth was not marked by headlines, but by something far holier, peace that asked for nothing in return. The palace had once taught her that every minute must be accounted for, every gesture rehearsed, every emotion contained. But now, life unfolded differently, softly, naturally, without choreography. Meghan's mornings began with the sound of her children's laughter echoing through sunlit rooms. She cooked breakfast with her own hands, humming old songs her mother used to sing. There were days when the house was messy, when the dishes piled up, when time slipped away unnoticed, and she loved it. "It feels alive," she once told a friend, "because it's real." There was no schedule to impress, no expectation to meet, only a quiet surrender to the ordinary. She found beauty in the smallest rituals. The way sunlight danced across the floorboards, the smell of bread rising in the oven, the gentle rhythm of her pen gliding across paper as she wrote letters of thanks. In those moments, she felt closer to herself than she ever had in the marble corridors of royalty. She learned that simplicity was not the opposite of luxury, it was its truest form. "I used to chase perfection," she wrote, "but it was imperfection that finally made me whole." The life Meghan left behind had not vanished, it lingered like a reflection in water, distorted, distant, yet undeniably hers. She carried the lessons of the palace not as burdens, but as bridges. In her foundation work, she met women who had been silenced, dismissed, or forgotten. They didn't ask about her title or her past, they asked how she had survived. With grace, she would answer, and a little rebellion. She spent hours listening to their stories. A refugee who crossed the sea with her child, an elderly nurse who had cared for strangers her whole life, a young girl who dreamed of becoming a writer but feared her voice didn't matter. To each of them, Meghan offered the same truth. You belong to the world, not its judgment. The tabloids had once defined her as divisive, but in rooms filled with laughter and vulnerability, she became a mirror, reflecting the strength of every woman who dared to begin again. Harry watched her quietly from across the room during one of these gatherings. Later that night, he said, "You don't just build bridges, Meg. You are one." And she smiled, because she finally believed it. Before she was a duchess, Meghan was a storyteller, a woman who believed in the power of words to mend what the world breaks. In the quiet rhythm of her new life, that voice returned. Late at night, after her children had fallen asleep, she sat at her desk with a single lamp glowing beside her. Her fingers moved slowly over paper, not typing, but writing, pen and ink, as if grounding each thought in the weight of her own hand. The words came not as defenses or declarations, but as reflections. She wrote about belonging, forgiveness, the ache of being seen too much and understood too little. Stories, she wrote, are how we return to ourselves. When publishers approached her for a memoir, she smiled politely and declined. "This isn't a story for the world," she said, "it's a story for the heart." She began writing children's tales, simple, luminous stories about courage, kindness, and truth. Tales that mirrored her journey but belonged to everyone. They were not about princesses or palaces, but about gardens, families, and the quiet power of love. Through her stories, Meghan found what fame had once stolen from her. A voice that belonged to no one but herself. For much of her life, Meghan had been told she did not belong. Too American, too outspoken, too different. Yet, as the years unfolded, she realized belonging was never about others' acceptance. It was about one's own surrender to self. Belonging, she told an audience once, is not a place. It's a peace. In California, under the same golden light that had witnessed her healing, she found her own definition of home, not built on legacy or lineage, but on laughter, truth, and the small daily kindnesses that stitch a life together. On quiet evenings, she often sat by the window, watching her children chase fireflies in the garden. Harry would join her, their shoulders touching, the air warm with simplicity. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked once, meaning the palace, the titles, the grandeur. Meghan smiled, her gaze fixed on the fading horizon. "I used to," she said. "But then he realized I was never meant to fit into someone else's story." She had stopped trying to belong to the world, and in doing so, she finally belonged to herself. In the gentle quiet of her later years, Meghan often found herself returning to the lessons of her mother, Doria. They spoke frequently, sometimes in long phone calls that stretched late into the night, sometimes in person as they shared tea under the bougainville at Hat Grew Wild in the garden. Doria had always been a woman of calm strength, soft-spoken but unbreakable, a mirror of the dignity Meghan had tried to live by. "You can't control how people see you," her mother would say, "but you can choose how you see yourself." Those words had carried Meghan through the darkest chapters of her royal years. Now, they became her compass for peace. Doria, with her quiet laughter and knowing eyes, reminded her that grace was inherited not from lineage, but from love. One afternoon, Meghan found an old photograph, her mother Sean's guiding her tiny ones over a piano key. The memory brought tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. "Everything I learned about strength," she whispered, "came from softness." Their bond, once shadowed by distance and duty, had deepened into something sacred, not mother and daughter, but two women walking side by side through the same garden of understanding. As Meghan grew older, her audience shifted. No longer the young crowds chasing glamour, but women of quiet wisdom, mothers, grandmothers, widows, survivors. They came to her gatherings not for spectacle, but for solace. Meghan would speak slowly, her tone almost a whisper, her words carrying the weight of experience. "We spend our first half of life chasing," she said once, "and the second half learning to let go." The women nodded, some with tears, some with knowing smiles. Afterward, they would linger, sharing stories about lost loves, children grown, and dreams that had simply changed shape. Meghan listened, truly listened, and in doing so, became one of them. She no longer stood on a stage, she sat in a circle. There was no distance between Duchess and woman, no line between teacher and student. "What do you want most now?" one elderly woman asked her softly. Meghan smiled. "Peace that doesn't depend on silence," she said. In those moments, she wasn't a figure of fame, she was a reflection of every woman who had survived the noise and chosen grace. For all her compassion, Meghan had her own wounds to tend. There were nights when the old ghosts returned, the loneliness of palace walls, the sting of betrayal, the ache of words printed in ink she could never erase. Sometimes, Harry would find her on the porch, staring quietly at the moon. "You're thinking again," he'd tease softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Always," she'd reply, smiling faintly. But over time, she learned that healing was not about forgetting, but integrating, allowing pain to sit beside joy without overshadowing it. Through meditation, journaling, and therapy, she built a gentler relationship with herself. "I no longer want to be unbreakable," she said in an interview. "I want to be whole." The strength she once performed had transformed into something quieter, endurance without hardness, love without fear. She realized that being a healer didn't mean never hurting, it meant continuing to love, even when it hurt. That lesson, she later said, was her truest act of faith, the decision to keep her heart open, in a world that had given her 1,000 reasons to close it. Through every storm, Harry had been there, steady, flawed, human. Their love had evolved from passion to partnership, from urgency to understanding. "We were both searching for freedom," Meghan told him once, "but maybe what we found was each other." They no longer needed grand gestures. Their affection lived in the quiet, a shared look across the breakfast table, the way Harry brushed the stray hair from her face, the laughter that came easily now. Their home, once a refuge, had become a sanctuary. They spoke less about the world's opinions and more about their children's futures, about how to raise them not to carry resentment, but responsibility. On evenings when the sea breeze drifted through the windows, they would sit together in silence. Not the heavy silence of their past, but the comforting one that comes from being known completely. "We've been through so much," Harry whispered once. Meghan nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "and yet we still choose each other, that's love." It was not a fairy tale ending, but something truer, a partnership built not on perfection, but on grace. As the years folded gently into one another, Meghan began to view her life not as a series of events, but as a single, ongoing prayer, one whispered softly between the earth and the sky. On the final evening of summer, she walked along the beach near her home, the Pacific stretching endlessly before her. The sun melted into the horizon, turning the waves into molten gold. She paused, breathing in the salt and silence. Behind her, laughter drifted. Harry's voice, Archie's running footsteps, Lilibet's soft giggle. She smiled, her heart full. "This," she thought, "is my kingdom. No crowns, no courtiers, no audience, only love, unguarded and infinite." She watched as the last light touched the water, shimmering like a promise. "Let them remember me kindly," she whispered, "that's all I ask." As dusk settled, she turned back toward her family, her silhouette framed by the dying light. The tide crept gently over her footprints, erasing them, as if to remind her that no one owns their legacy, it lives on in the hearts we touch. And so, as the sea carried her reflection into eternity, Meghan walked forward, graceful, grounded, free.